The papacy that he conducted so brilliantly in the minds of many people here over the last 26 plus years. With that, back to you.
Indeed, for so many of the world's Catholics, Pope John Paul II was an inspirational leader whose robust views and clear leadership were respected and valued. Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, the leader of Roman Catholics in England and Wales, told our religious correspondent Robert Pigott about the special qualities of John Paul's papacy.
I don't think there's been any pope who has had such an impact in world affairs and indeed within the Roman Catholic Church as this man has had. A long pontificate in the modern age of great change, not only in the Church but also in the world. I think that he can fairly be described as a man who influenced affairs both of Church and world in the latter part of the last century and the beginning of this.
What were the Pope's greatest achievements?
One would be in what he taught. Here he was towards the end of the last century with many questions problematic. And he decided, I will address them. What's the nature of the Church itself? What about matters concerning life, the beginning of life, the end of life, the respect for life? What about truth? What is true? Is there such a thing as an objective truth for everyone? He tackled that. And how does truth relate to faith? So his teaching on many, many matters, and particularly, I might say, his teaching on matters of social justice. And he would confront leaders, as he did on many occasions, saying, you have to have a proper justice in your dealings with the people of your country, and the rights of minorities. All these things he came out in his teaching and the speeches that he gave. Secondly, I would say he will, of course, be remembered as a Polish pope and the effect he had in Eastern Europe. There's no doubt that his visits to Poland and his speeches and his presence contributed a huge amount to the breakdown of that aspect of the Russian Empire and the fall of communism. And thirdly, he's the only pope that's been a world evangelist. There's been no pope, I suppose, had the opportunity as he's had to go all around the world. And therefore I think there is no doubt in this global village that we now live in with mass communications, he has established the papacy as a moral voice for the whole world in a way no other pope was able to do.
How far are we right to see him as a bastion against modernization in the Church?
Certainly he was traditional in the sense that the tradition of the Church as handed down to him, he was determined that it must be preserved and deepened. But he was extraordinarily open. No other pope had been open to other faiths in the way he had, with the meetings at Assisi, with the leaders of all religions. There were a lot of cardinals who didn't like that at all. No other pope had been to Jerusalem, and with those words, wonderful words of sorrow and apology to the Jews, the Jewish people. No other pope had actually spoken so forcibly for human rights. He wasn't conservative in that sense at all.
But conservative in the sense of things like divorce, stem cell research perhaps, but contraception, things that have become...
I think in all the areas concerning social life, but particularly maybe ethical questions and moral questions touching on sexuality, he was conservative, but I don't like the word. I think he wanted always to build on what he saw as the traditional teaching of the Church, but also seeing that in a life-giving way. So it wasn't just, I'm against this or I'm against that. It was seeing he had a vision of the human body, a vision of sexuality and its proper use, which I think he was determined to uphold and present to society.
How will the world remember John Paul II?
I think that everyone who saw him, and above all people who met him, and the millions in a way who met him one way or another, will think of it an extraordinary, dramatic and loving personality. which impacted on them in different ways. I think a good example of this was his many encounters with young people. What he said was not extraordinary, but they were captivated by the personality of the man who said these things about God, about Christ, about the challenges that face them.
Over the past quarter of a century, Pope John Paul made constant efforts to strengthen links with the world's other faiths. But his stance on several fundamental questions, notably the ordination of women, strained his relationship with Anglicans. Nonetheless, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams, established a warm personal bond with the Pope when he visited Rome in October 2003.
A man of immense solidity. I think solidity is the word I'd use more than anything. A depth of experience, a depth of spirituality, and a strength that had been moulded through some of the most grave experiences, the most testing experiences of the 20th century. And I felt, when I met him, that here was a man who had, in a very particular sense, lived through the 20th century, as few people have. Someone who had suffered both under Nazism and under communism, someone who had lived through and indeed contributed vastly to the fall of tyranny in Eastern Europe, someone in whom the whole history of the age was imprinted, hence the strength, I think, all of that absorbed into prayer.
You've talked about the way in which he contributed to the fall of communism. What to you were his greatest achievements?
It's early days to measure what the long-term achievements will look like, but I think that his achievement will probably be seen less in terms of any kind of structural reform in the Church, which was not his priority in the way that some people see it, but in terms of constantly drawing the Church back to its centre, to the priority of contemplation, of holiness, and drawing strength from those deep wells.
His death now will be felt very, very keenly by the Church, not just because of the length of his papacy.
His death will be felt, I think, not only by Roman Catholics, but by all Christians. I think everyone has felt, whatever their degree of agreement or disagreement with him on specific matters, that here was a spokesman for the central truths of Christianity, a spokesman for Jesus Christ who stood alone. And no, it's not just the length of his papacy that's important here. It's the quality of the man, and even those who have disagreed with him in his own church most profoundly have, I think, always recognized that here is someone who will undoubtedly be seen as one of the greatest Christians of the century.
Of course, there hasn't always been complete agreement with the Anglican Church, but he did welcome you extremely warmly when you went to the Vatican and gave you, I think, that pectoral cross.
I believe that when he first became Pope, the Anglican Church was an abstract idea to him. When he met Anglicans throughout the time of his papacy, he was always receptive, understanding, eager to teach and to learn. He was very forthright in his criticisms of some things which the Anglican Church did, and that is, I think, no less than we should expect from a faithful and prayerful friend. Looking back, what one or two memories do you have of the Pope that particularly stand out? Like a lot of people, I think I shall remember the visit he paid to the man who tried to kill him. He went to prison to meet the man who had attempted to kill him, to offer him his forgiveness and to offer him reconciliation. And I think that was an absolutely simple gospel gesture which ought to be somewhere near the very peak of the profile of his papacy. More personally, I think I can remember the intensity and steadiness of his gaze when we met. He was already quite ill, couldn't say a great deal, but I remember the minutes we spent together. He simply held my hand and looked at me, and the sense of a look that was judging and merciful and God-centered is one that will stay with me.
Well, we've heard now that the Conservatives too will suspend public campaigning today as a remark of respect following the death of the Pope. The Liberal Democrats, meanwhile, say they have no special events scheduled and Charles Kennedy will not be campaigning today. The defining moment of his pontificate for many observers was the Pope's first visit to his native Poland. As Pope, He addressed the millions of people and drew the world's attention to the struggle between the state's communist ideology and the democratic aims of the Solidarity Union. As Angus Roxburgh reports, many people regard his stance against communism as his greatest achievement.
In 1979, a year after being elected, the Polish Pope returned home to start a revolution. Millions turned out to see him wherever he went. No communist country had ever seen anything like it.
Maluchy ze mną tak kiwały.
John Paul did nothing so crude as to criticise the authorities. He merely gave the people a sense of moral superiority and hope. Solidarity was the communist bloc's first free trade union, set up in the heat of strikes led by Lech Wałęsa at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk. Inspired by the Polish Pope, they humiliated the government.
The Holy Father brought back moral values, and they defeated the communist system. The communists were as frightened of those values as the devil is of holy water. So the Pope is the author of the victory over communism.
Wałęsa signed the document recognising Solidarity with an outsized souvenir Pope pen. The truce with the communists was fragile and Solidarity was soon banned. But even the man who imposed martial law to squash it understood that the Pope's influence had lit a flame that could not be doused again.
Of course, the social and economic conditions were ripe for a protest, but the Pope and his teachings served as a detonator who liberated the spirit of society and gave it strength.
In 1987, on his third visit to Poland, the Pope prayed at the Gdansk monument to workers killed by the communist regime. Now he seemed to take a conscious step from the pulpit into the political arena. Celebrating Mass before a crowd of 750,000, he told them there is no struggle more effective than solidarity.
Społecznej solidarności.
Now the scene was set for revolution, not just in Poland, but all over Eastern Europe. The sense of inner freedom inspired by the Pope here was spreading throughout the communist bloc, and with a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, simultaneously loosening the chains, it was only a matter of time before the people would break free. At the end of 1989, Gorbachev went to the Vatican for a historic meeting between the man who nudged Eastern Europe towards freedom and the man who let them go. It set the seal on a year, indeed a decade, of change in the communist bloc. Free elections in Poland, won overwhelmingly by Solidarity, started a chain reaction which ended with the dismantling of the Berlin Wall. Doubtless it would all have happened eventually anyway, but without the Polish Pope, it might have taken much longer.
In 2003, the Pope celebrated the 25th anniversary of his papacy. Despite his failing health, he took part in events to commemorate the occasion as pilgrims flocked to Rome.
Pope John Paul's Silver Jubilee was marked by a series of spectacular events. First, there was a Mass in St. Peter's Square.
In
keeping with the Pope's own request, the personal aspect of the anniversary was played down. But even though it was a solemn rather than a festive occasion, pilgrims came from around the world to celebrate his epic reign.
John Pope the Great, John Pope the Terrific, John Pope the Good, John Pope, any title that conveys his tremendous benevolence.
2 days later, he presided over an exotic set piece, the beatification of Mother Teresa, the nun who devoted her life to the dead and dying on the streets of Calcutta. This rich intertwining of East and West featured Indian dancers, a phial of Mother Teresa's blood, and an audience of more than 300,000.
Her life was a radical living
In a homily read for the Pope by an Indian archbishop, John Paul called Mother Teresa's life a testimony to the dignity and the privilege of humble service. Mother Teresa's rapid beatification, bringing her to the threshold of sainthood a mere 6 years after her death, is the quickest in the Church's history. To Pope John Paul, she was the ideal Catholic role model. The day was rounded off with a colourful firework display lighting up Vatican City. The Pope viewed the scene from his private apartments. Tellingly, though, his secretary had to gently remind him to bless the crowd. John Paul's tiring series of engagements ended with his presenting red hats or berettas to 30 newly created cardinals.
Al Cardinale Keith Michael Patrick O'Brien.
Among them was the Archbishop of St Andrews and Edinburgh, Keith O'Brien, only the third Scottish cardinal to be appointed since the Reformation. The Pope presided over the service from his wheeled throne. His voice was weak, and at times he struggled to speak. These princes of the Church will now decide who succeeds the longest reigning Pope of recent times. Bronwyn Jeffries, BBC News.
Tributes to the Pope have been flooding into the BBC website. Our correspondent Matthew Charles has been reading what you've written.
Joanne in Liverpool says, I heard His Holiness say Mass at Liverpool's Roman Catholic Cathedral in 1982. I was 15 years old and I remember it as if it were yesterday. He was a gift from God. We also have tributes coming in from the Pope's native Poland. Agnieszka says, I am so proud to be one of the Pope's countrymen and I'll always try to keep him alive in my words, deeds and in my heart. But these tributes also showing that the Pope's legacy transcended religions. Dina Nasser in Cairo in Egypt says Pope John Paul II was an amazing man. If only our world leaders would look up to him and learn a thing or two about compassion. As a Muslim, I'll be praying for him. Scott in America says Pope John Paul was a great world leader. We can only pray that the current crop of leaders around the world look to his example and practice tolerance and love instead of bigotry. So lots of emails coming into us there at the BBC, an example of the Pope's lasting legacy.
Well, let's just take you back to Rome now, and the scene at St Peter's Square in front of the Basilica there lit up as it has been for the last couple of days. Hundreds of people waiting there, keeping vigil and praying for Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II has died at the age of 84 after a long struggle with illness. Tens of thousands of mourners have gathered in St Peter's Square in Rome. Pope John Paul has been leader of the Catholic Church since 1978. Among tributes from around the world, President Bush says the world has lost a champion of human freedom. This is BBC News. I'm Karen Giannoni. The spiritual leader of the world's Roman Catholics, Pope John Paul II, has died. He had been gravely ill since Thursday. He died in bed at his apartment in the Vatican. His condition had worsened considerably in the past 24 hours with severe heart and kidney problems allied to the effects of Parkinson's disease. This is the scene live in Rome. Tens of thousands of people have been gathering throughout the day in Rome's St Peter's Square to pay tribute to the pontiff. They were waiting for news for many hours, and when the news came, church bells throughout the city began to toll the news of the Pope's death. He's said to have continued to receive visitors until close to the very end, but the news finally came at 9:37 p.m. local time from the Vatican, following a series of worsening health problems, including heart failure. Gavin Hewitt has this report on the day's events.
It had been the announcement that Rome had long expected.
Carissimi fratelli e sorelle, alle 21:37 il nostro amatissimo.
Dearest brothers and sisters, at 9:27, our beloved Holy Father, John Paul II, returned to the house of our Father. At first, the crowd in St. Peter's Square was silent as it took in Archbishop Sandri's words. Then, many broke down in tears as the Vatican's funeral bell was rung. During the day, they had been chanting the Pope's name, willing him to defy his failing health. Now, some stood with heads bowed, while others sang hymns. One man kissed a picture of the Pope he was holding. There was real affection here for a leader who had travelled more than any other Pope and had fought illness for so long. Many said that this man of strong, unbending faith had been an inspiration.
He was instrumental in my deciding to become a priest and has been an inspiration for me throughout my priesthood. His courage, his tenacity, his evangelical nature that continued to inspire me and continues to inspire the world.
So many mixed emotions, so sad, so somber, but so happy he's called home. It
Peaceful.
Sounds like he was ready.
Sure, I know. A couple weeks ago he said he had abandoned himself to God's will, and for someone to have that strength and that courage, and that he was at peace with his situation right now. So I think that's how we all can feel.
Exactly, and it sounds like he was still coherent and lucid, up to the final moments of his life, and that's to be able to, pass on with such dignity. That's how he lived his whole life.
In the square, there were people from the Pope's native Poland who remembered his part in ending communism in Eastern Europe.
But I think that we are proud that a Pope was Polish and that it was a huge man for all church, really.
An archbishop told the crowd, "We all feel like orphans this evening." And it was immediately apparent that there'll be a huge outpouring of grief for the man who led the Catholic Church for 26 years. As soon as the Pope's death was announced, people began streaming here to St. Peter's Square, and they're still arriving now. Many of them are in tears, but many of them also spoke warmly about the Pope's struggle over the last few days, saying they were among the most impressive days of his papacy, living out his message that there can be serenity even in the heart of suffering. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, at the Vatican.
The leader of the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, appeared on the steps of Westminster Cathedral in central London shortly after the announcement to pay his tribute. Westminster Cathedral in London will remain open all night. Around the world, over 1 billion Catholics are now in mourning. Matthew Charles reports on international reactions.
The news, when it came, confirmed what pilgrims gathered in St. Peter's Square knew they would hear. There was silence, private thoughts, tears, but then also this. Appreciation shown for a pope who's inspired and guided the thinking of the Church for more than 2.5 decades. Even to the end, he maintained a determination to discharge his duties to the Catholic community of 1 billion souls. The lights in his private apartment still burning. Tributes are flooding in from across the globe. In the United States, President Bush gave his reaction to the news.
The Catholic Church has lost its shepherd. The world has lost a champion of human freedom. And a good and faithful servant of God has been called home.
The leader of the Catholic Church in England and Wales also paid tribute.
We'll remember him for his endurance of suffering, even to the very end. And we'll remember him, and I think the whole world should remember him, for reminding us tirelessly that this world is not the only world, that there's a world to come, our eternal destiny.
Nowhere will the loss be felt more keenly than in his native Poland. He was Archbishop of Krakow before being appointed Pope, the first non-Italian in that position for more than 4 centuries.
We used to think about Pope as a member of the family, and it's always said if a person so close dies.
After days of medical bulletins charting the decline of the Pope's health, it is now time for those who'd gathered to support the pontiff in his final moments to consider the future of a church without him. Matthew Charles, BBC News.
Well, live now to our correspondent Katya Adler from St. Peter's Square in Rome. Katya, this was the news that everybody had expected, but nobody wanted to hear.
That's absolutely right. And in fact, as the news was broken here at the Vatican, tens of thousands of people were already gathered in St. Peter's Square to pray for the Pope. They believed that he was still in his dying moments. And many of them said that at that point they didn't expect that he could get better anymore, but they were praying that at least when he passed away, it would be peacefully and serenely. So people knew that the end was very near indeed. But I think you've seen there pictures of the obvious grief of people as the news was broken. Many people beginning to cry, comforting one another. One custom here in Italy, when somebody dies, when the news is announced of a death, people clap. That's to show their appreciation of the greatness of the person who's just passed away. And that's what we saw here in St. Peter's Square as well tonight. After the news was broken, first there was silence, and then there was an outbreak of clapping while some people cried and were comforted by their neighbours. One young Italian described the atmosphere in the square at the moment as if the square had been transformed into one big living room where the Catholic family was joined together as they mourned the passing away of a father. So that's how she described it. But of course, there weren't just Catholics in the square tonight. There were people of many faiths, also people who said they don't believe in God at all, but who still felt a great deal of respect for the Pope, who the Vatican said was the most famous person in the whole world.
Now, Italy is in 3 days of official mourning. What are we expecting to happen at the Vatican over the course of the next few days?
Well, after the confusion of the last 48 hours where people were really not sure how exactly the Pope was and how quick his demise would be, now there is a strict set of rules that go into play. In fact, from the moment of his death, a very key persona now at this particular moment in time is the Vatican's Chamberlain. His role immediately after the death of the Pope was to really check that he was dead. Now, this tradition goes back many centuries where there had been fear that somebody may try to impersonate the Pope after his death. So in order to make sure that this cannot be the case, the Chamberlain calls the Pope out by his baptismal name 3 times. If the Pope doesn't answer, he then pronounces the Pope dead. Then the papal apartments have to be emptied of all the Pope's possessions, his furniture, and also his body has to be removed. When that has been done, the Chamberlain then seals off the apartment. Nobody will go inside now until a new Pope is elected. The Pope's body will lie in state at the Basilica at the Vatican, and that from Monday onwards. Whereas Italy is calling 3 days of mourning as of tomorrow, the Vatican has announced 9 days of mourning. This is a fixed period of mourning after a Pope dies. The funeral, well, that will be announced on Monday, and we expect it right at the end of the week. Cardinals from all over the world are being summoned to Rome. They meet for the first time on Monday, and they will set the exact date of the funeral. They will then meet again in over 2 weeks' time in order to start the process of electing a new Pope. Now, this can go on for an unlimited amount of time, but the last 2 times a Pope was elected, they'd made their decision within about 48 hours. So these are all the procedures that will now go into play here at the Vatican. When the Pope's body is buried after he's lain in state until his funeral, he will be buried in the crypt, which is under the Basilica at the Vatican.
Katia Adler in Rome, thank you. Well, more reaction now. Let's cross to the BBC's Jeremy Cook in New York. Jeremy, how are people taking the news there?
Well, obviously with great sadness. We have to remember there are something like 97 million Roman Catholics in the United States. Almost a quarter of the population regard themselves as Catholics. And here, just behind me, I don't know if you can see in the darkness, St. Patrick's Cathedral here in Manhattan. And it's been the scene of extraordinary scenes during the afternoon. Of course, a lot of local Catholics have been here to share their grief and to listen to a special Mass. But also, this being New York, there's been a very much an international element here as well. People from all over the world who are here as tourists or perhaps here on business have been joining the proceedings, and they've been talking to us about feeling part of an extended, huge global family of the faithful, and all here and united in their grief for John Paul II, the man who is very clear tonight was held in great regard by people from across the world.
Indeed, a warm tribute coming from the White House and George Bush. In the past, though, the 2 men hadn't always seen eye to eye.
That's right, it's been a curious relationship, but certainly there have been huge disagreements about, for instance, the war in Iraq, and Pope John Paul II was very vocal in his criticism of George W. Bush's policies there in the Middle East. Also, he once described America as having what he called a culture of death, and he was there referring, of course, to the death penalty, capital punishment here, and drug abuse as well. So he was critical of the United States at times, but also when you look at the ascendance of the conservative agenda here in America, and in particular the issue of abortion, it's clear that the White House would have been very supportive, and there would have been mutual support between the Vatican and the White House on that issue. So a complicated relationship, and I think you know, George W. Bush, the president, was very generous in his appreciation of John Paul II when he spoke a few hours ago when the news of the Pope's death came through on the wires here in the United States.
OK, Jeremy Cook in New York, many thanks. At least 100,000 people have gathered in St. Peter's Square in Rome as Catholics around the world mourn the death of the Pope. Andrew Burrows looks back now at his life and achievements.
He was the first Slavic pope in history, the first non-Italian for 450 years, and the youngest pontiff for a century. His charisma made him the first papal superstar, taking his message around the world. He was staunchly conservative on theology and morals, strengthening the Church's opposition to women priests, contraception and abortion.
No one ever has the authority to destroy unborn life.
Karol Wojtyła grew up in southern Poland, the son of an army sergeant. His mother and brother died before he was 14. After the outbreak of World War II, he studied for the priesthood. In the 1960s, as Archbishop of Krakow, he gained popularity, pressuring the communist authorities to allow a church in the steel town of Nowa Huta. It was built like a ship, one that launched him as a papal candidate. His support for human rights and Poland's Solidarity trade union shook the communist world. There were risks. The attempt on his life in 1981 raised suspicions of Bulgarian Secret Service and KGB involvement. After a remarkable recovery, he offered forgiveness to his Turkish would-be assassin, Ali Aja. The Pope out-travelled all previous pontiffs, visiting scores of countries. In the developing world, his insistence on papal authority was welcomed, just as it was resented by liberal Westerners. He kept 2 of his 9 Pope-mobiles in South America, where left-wing liberation theology was popular. He believed it resembled communism, and he personally rebuked its leaders. His travels took him to Ireland, where a 1 million-strong congregation heard his plea for peace.
On my knees, I beg you to turn away from the path of violence and to return to the ways of peace.
At Canterbury, a historic encounter with Archbishop Robert Runcie failed to bring joint Anglican-Catholic communion services closer, the Pope opposing reunion with any church which ordained women. Inside the world's smallest state, the Pope made sweeping changes, de-Italianizing the Vatican. Under the staunchly conservative Cardinal Ratzinger, head of doctrine, a liberation theologian would be sentenced to a year's silence, a liberal professor stripped of his ecclesiastical license, a conservative bishop appointed against local wishes. The Vatican faced the scandal of paedophile priests. As victims spoke out, cardinals from America accused of shielding the guilty were summoned to a papal lecture. Under Pope John Paul, critics bemoaned the reversal of reforms of the 1960s aimed at making the Church more open to the world. But he believed it was the world which should conform to the Church to receive salvation.
The mission of salvation, that is the mission of the Church. And this mission is still actual, is still of today and of tomorrow.
As old age and disease took their grip, the Pope embarked on a mission of reconciliation for the new millennium. In Athens, he braved black flags of protest to offer peace to Orthodox leaders, apologising for past Catholic wrongs against the Greek Church. And he became the first pope to enter a Muslim prayer hall, visiting the tomb of St. John the Baptist, which today lies inside a Syrian mosque. The Pope chose the celebrations of 25 years of his papacy for one of his most popular decrees, beatifying Mother Teresa of Calcutta, bestowing this step towards sainthood just 6 years after her death. She will join a record number of saints that Pope John Paul leaves behind. All provide modern role models for today's Catholics to pray to. His papacy drew many lines he believed the Church should not cross. But above all, Pope John Paul II gave Catholics back their confidence in who they are and what they stand for.
Well, I'm joined now live from our Washington studio by Dr. Kenneth Schmitz, visiting scholar at the Pope John Paul II Cultural Centre. Many thanks for being with us. Your thoughts, if you will, on this news?
Well, it's, of course, an enormous difference. I've met so many people and spoken to them personally and over the telephone who seem to be touched as though it was a close relative who died. And I think that speaks very much for the way he was able to touch people, of course Catholics, but also many who are not members of the Church. And I think that probably is the most stunning quality of his papacy.
Is it too soon at this point to assess the papacy in any kind of historical sense?
Well, of course, we've begun it since he's been around for a quarter of a century, and he's very voluminous with his writings and so on. We have been working at it, but I do think you're right that it's going to take about a generation for us to really absorb the changes. You know, he is often spoken of as conservative, and in some sense, he does conserve the substance of the teaching of the Church. But I think a better word would be traditional, because traditional is handing on, but yet open to developments, and it is clear that he has changed not the substance of the doctrine of the Church, but that he has changed the way the Church is relating to the world and engaging the world in a very positive way.
But that hasn't always been problem-free, according to other areas of the Church. His stance on certain areas of Catholic doctrine have brought him into conflict.
Oh yes, there's no doubt that Catholic doctrine is in many, many ways, there are aspects of it that are countercultural. But he did speak out from his own faith understanding regarding those aspects. So he stood up as a witness, but a very coherent and consistent one, I think.
Now, during the course of his long illness, there's been much talk behind the scenes of his successor. Do you think the Church is going to be looking for a successor in the same mould, or are we going to be seeing something completely different?
Well, you know, that is speculation, isn't it? And a little bit of gossip. But I suppose there are two possibilities. One is a very strong successor, and the other is one who would continue his legacy. Possibly the Church would prosper by a certain period of reflection in utilizing and realizing and thinking through the enormous deposit of writings and actions that he has given us.
Dr. Kenneth Schmitz from Washington, we must leave it there. Many thanks for joining us. Well, earlier, the BBC's Brian Hanrahan spoke by video phone to our correspondent Steve Kingston, who's in Sao Paulo in Brazil, the largest Roman Catholic country in the world. He described the reaction from people there.
Well, it was very interesting. When the news came through, there was actually a mass taking place in the cathedral behind me here in the center of Sao Paulo. The Cardinal, Archbishop of Sao Paulo, Claudio Gomes, had been describing this Pope as one of the greatest popes of all time, perhaps the greatest of the past 100 years. He didn't receive the news of the death during the Mass, so people only heard that news when they came out, and it is still sinking in. Many people coming out feeling a great sense of sadness. Some of the people we spoke to were crying. From the President of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, statement in the past few minutes. He says, the people of Brazil, the biggest Roman Catholic country in the world, are profoundly saddened by the death of John Paul II. His 3 visits here will always be remembered with strong emotion. He carried out his mission with energy and clarity. The suffering, which he didn't hide in his later years, never weakened his determination.
And Steve, the Pope's approach to Latin America was extremely robust, wasn't it? He used to call them to order to make sure that the theology developed there didn't stray away from the main Catholic line.
That's right. When this Pope took office, Latin America was deeply polarized between, on the one side, right-wing military-backed dictatorships across much of the region, and on the other side, Marxist guerrilla forces that in many cases were waging revolutionary wars against those dictatorships. And there are plenty of people here who feel that the Pope should have intervened on the side of the political left at that time, and they've never forgiven him for distancing the Church from that particular fight at that particular time. Now, what's being stressed by the Pope's supporters now is that he did care very deeply about Brazilian issues. It's inequality, economic inequality, that still really scars this country and this continent, and it's being stressed that whenever the Pope came here, he wanted to speak to Brazil's homeless, Brazil's indigenous populations, and Brazil's urban poor, that he really wanted to understand, share, and help solve their suffering.
In Poland, thousands of people have attended church services. In the city of Krakow, Catholics prayed for a man who'd once been their local priest and archbishop. Well, joining me now from Krakow is our correspondent, Tristana Moore. Tristana, how are people there reacting to the news?
Well, there's a real sense of loss here in Krakow, and hundreds of people are still gathering outside the Archbishop's palace here, looking up to the window where the Pope used to appear on his previous visits to this city. They're holding candles, praying. They've brought flowers, many of them, and some are intending to spend the night there to pay their respects. The churches in the city are still open. Some are being held open through the night. And Poland is now in a period of national mourning. The Polish President Aleksander Kwaśniewski earlier appeared on Polish television and paying tribute to the Pope. He said, "He was a great Pope, the most eminent Pole, the father of us all, has passed away." And he went on to say, "We have lost our friend and spiritual leader." And other tributes as well from Lech Wałęsa, who led the Solidarity movement here in Poland in the 1980s. He said, "Without John Paul II, there would have been no end to communism." And the feeling here amongst many Poles is not only have they lost this father figure, a spiritual leader, but also somebody who helped to bring about the fall of communism.
Katia, you've been speaking to people down on the square there tonight. What are people saying about a future successor to the Pope? Tristana, I'm sorry, you didn't hear me there. What are people saying about a possible successor to this Pope, which will be a very hard act to follow?
Well, I don't think people really are looking ahead to the future so much now. At the moment, there is this period of mourning. However, people do regard the Pope as the only Polish Pope. He was the father of the nation, and he was very much a national hero. And I think they will be united in prayers for many days to come.
Tristana Moore in Krakow for us. Many thanks. At least 100,000 people have gathered in St. Peter's Square in Rome as Catholics around the world mourn the death of the Pope. The Vatican said John Paul II died peacefully in his apartment, his final hours marked by uninterrupted prayer. He was 84 and had led the Church for 26 years.
Hello there, we had some mild weather on Saturday. Quick look back at the temperatures, quite nice, 17s, 18s. Won't do as well for the day today, but could even be on the wet side as well for many. Band of rain coming into parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, spreading in the wet weather here. Elsewhere, it is just some patchy cloud, fairly bright to start with, over eastern parts of England, down towards the southeast. The odd bit of mist, but our band of rain coming into western Scotland, Northern Ireland, slowly working south and east through the day. So by the afternoon, we'll probably see it over a fair part of Scotland, just fringing into the northwest parts of Wales and There could even be the odd shower just sneaking up ahead of our weather front, maybe into northern parts of England, but still fairly bright and dry over much of East Anglia, the southeast, and also brighter skies behind our weather front into western Scotland, Northern Ireland, and it will feel cooler and fresher here, maybe only 10s to 12s behind our weather front, but we still could perhaps see a 15 to 17 across the south and the east. But Monday is a wet day as well over a fair part of England, even Wales with our weather front sitting down about here, so grab the umbrella with that. Brighter skies behind it, and then seeing quite a few showers work into parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, with enough cold air coming in. Some of these could even be wintry over the higher ground of Scotland. A bit of thunder as well, and the temperatures maybe 9s, 10s, 11s. Still perhaps getting to about 12 to 14 across the south and the east. Then to Tuesday, it's a bit of a resting day in between weather systems. The first one moves away, high pressure builds in. This one, another band of rain spreading into Scotland and Northern Ireland with some heavier downpours even as it comes across Scotland and Northern Ireland through the day. Not bad down towards the southeast, just maybe the odd shower here and there, and temperatures 9s to still maybe 13, 14 further south and east. For Wednesday, quite an unsettled day with quite a massive weather system moving across. Good bit of rain with it as well. Some heavy downpours, even from, say, southern parts of Wales right up into northern England as this whole mass of rain works through. Still maybe some winteriness over the higher ground of Scotland and the whole massive rain spreading its way through as we go through Wednesday. Even a bit of wind as well, windy sort of day with temperatures cool, perhaps 9s, 10s for Scotland, same sort of thing Northern Ireland. Maybe further south, 12 to 13, so definitely getting cooler as we go in towards the middle of the week. And staying unsettled as well, probably into the later parts of the week. Quick peek at things across to the continent, maybe heading there for the day. It looks not too bad for the most part. There is a big ridge of high pressure over most of the central and eastern parts of the continent. Obviously, fairly sunny to say the least here for the next day or so. 18 for Paris, fine here. Not bad, and even further south, Rome, looking at fine weather. Notice just further south, seeing a few showers, but generally most of the central, eastern parts of the continent in pretty good shape. That's the weather for now.
A journey deep into the unknown.
It is dark down here. You try turning the camera around so I can pick up that light over.
Unique images captured on camera for the first time.
You can just see the end of its tail wiggling. I have no idea what that was. Something big went over. Beautiful fish. Some of the patterns they have are amazing.
Amazon Abyss, a week of exploration, starts tomorrow at 7 on BBC One.
These men have tortured people. Governments condemn their methods, yet want the information they obtain.
I haven't yet seen one guy that don't talk.
I would torture them because they aren't human beings. Anyone can become a torturer.
And ask nobody for forgiveness.
Come face to face with the men who made a profession of pain. We have ways of making you talk. Tuesday at 9 on BBC Two.
Hello, you're watching BBC News. I'm Karen Giannoni. Pope John Paul II has died. He had been gravely ill since Thursday. He died in bed at his apartment in the Vatican. This is the scene live in Vatican City, where thousands of people have spent the day praying for the Pope. His condition had worsened considerably in the past 24 hours, with severe heart and kidney problems related to the effects of Parkinson's disease. Well, I'm joined in the studio by Eva Lichterowicz-Kryńska, a Polish-British doctor who met the Pope on several occasions and whose family had a long-standing relationship with him in Krakow. Eva, how will the people of Poland be taking this news?
Well, they're definitely feeling deep, deep sorrow, but they're also thankful for having known him, for having experienced him throughout these many years, and feeling very proud that he came from Poland.
Some have called him almost like a personal friend or relative or even a father to the people of Poland.
Definitely, but when he spoke at audiences, you could feel he was speaking to the masses, but he was also speaking to each individual within the crowd.
Now, you personally, you and your family have had a long-standing relationship with the Pope. Tell us a little about what he meant to you.
He meant to us a lot. Certainly my mother knew him as a student and then as a doctor. He would teach and he would have meetings with the students and doctors. Obviously, these were quite difficult in communist Poland. He would discuss medical ethics with them. But they had a very close relationship in the sense that all the students called him uncle. It wasn't bishop, it was uncle, because he was so easy to get on with. I met the Pope on a few occasions as a student. We had audiences in Castel Gandolfo. And after the Mass, he would actually sit down with us and chat and sing. And he knew how to have a great time with young people, and he knew how to communicate with them. But also, not only he could communicate with the masses, he could communicate with millions at a Mass, at a sermon, but he could also communicate with the individual. And we experienced this when our eldest daughter was going to die. He actually found time in his busy schedule as a pope. He actually wrote a personal letter to us and signed it himself, sent us a personal letter of support for us and for our family in this difficult time 9 years ago.
So a man who wasn't afraid to involve himself with people. We're looking here at pictures of his last appearance. That was on Easter Sunday last week. That must be very distressing. I mean, he was a clearly ill man. Very distressing for people to see.
This maybe was a lesson to us all. He respected life from the beginning right to the natural end. And he brought forward the respect and the dignity for people who are elderly, those who are sick, those who have little voice. It's watching this, yes, he was suffering, but he has taught us to respect these people who are ill, who are suffering, who are, through the dignity and the serenity that he spent his last days in.
Okay, Eva Lichterowicz-Krynska, many thanks for joining us here on BBC News. Well, let's go to Rome now and the BBC's Katya Adler. Katya, you're in St. Peter's Square. You've been down on the square talking to people there tonight. What is their purpose there tonight? They've been there for many days, some of them.
They have. Many were there, particularly last night when there was the recitation of the Rosary. They said then when I spoke to them they would return tonight, and indeed they did. Many were gathered in the square praying for the Pope when the news broke that indeed he had passed away. Despite that, there are still thousands of people in the square still now. Many young people who are just simply camping out there for the night. They're lying on the cold cobblestones in their sleeping bags, wrapped up in blankets, some of them. People have made impromptu shrines all over the square. There are candles all over the place. Pictures of Pope John Paul II as well, roses, flowers, people bursting out into spontaneous prayer, and some preferring just to think in silence. They are turned towards the third floor of the Vatican, where the lights are still shining in the Pope's private apartments there, and they are turned towards those apartments, looking up, and obviously in silent contemplation, silent prayer. So a scene of serenity and sadness, of course, too.
And what will be happening at the Vatican over the course of the next few days for those people by way of commemorating the Pope's life?
Well, first of all, the Pope's body will be laid in state as of Monday. So his body will be brought to the Basilica at the Vatican, and people can come past and pay their respects. The body will stay there until his funeral, which looks like it'll be right at the end of this week. We'll be hearing an exact date for the funeral on Monday, when the cardinals of the Church, of the Catholic Church, also known as the Princes of the Vatican, will gather together for the first time since the Pope's death, and they will announce the day of the funeral. That is on Monday. And what these cardinals will then do, in just over 2 weeks' time, they will meet again in what's called a conclave. This is where they sit together in secret and will decide the name of the next Pope. Until that happens, the Pope's private apartments, once his body has now been removed, once it has been emptied of all his private possessions, it will be sealed off altogether by the Chamberlain chaplain of the Vatican, he now becomes a very important person indeed. It is he who first officially pronounces the Pope dead. It is he who empties the apartment of all the Pope's belongings, and who will also organise the funeral and organise this conclave, this secret meeting of the cardinals who will now be coming into Rome from all over the world to meet and decide the name of the next Pope.
Katya Adler in Rome, many thanks. John Paul II will be remembered for being theologically orthodox and socially conservative, and for his strict control of the vast church he led. But the Pope won't be remembered as simply an autocratic conservative. He was an outspoken critic of capitalism and materialism, arguing instead for a fairer sharing out of wealth. His spirituality and his background as the first Polish Pope also meant that he meant many different things to Roman Catholics. Our religious affairs correspondent, Robert Pigott, now reports.
John Paul II ruled the Roman Catholic Church like a sovereign monarch. Those who visited him, such as the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, paid their respects at what amounted to a court, the centre of power in a global church, including 1 in 6 of the world's population. His death tonight leaves the church with a gaping hole at its heart. The Pope entered the Vatican intending to reinforce what he saw as Roman Catholic orthodoxy. His uncompromising determination to enforce his will has left his successor to confront difficult issues. John Paul has left Catholics with a highly centralised church. The effects of concentrating Catholic power in Rome had their most devastating effect in America. It emerged that in the last 50 years, almost 4,500 American priests had been credibly accused of sexual abuse. American bishops who'd been undermined by years of rule from Rome had lost the initiative to tackle the problem. They tried to cover it up instead. The result has been disastrous damage to the church's reputation and compensation likely to exceed $1 billion.
Even bishops who are normally loyal to the Holy See and never speak a word out of turn have actually been extremely critical about the way in which the department in Rome concerned with the liturgy has treated them.
The next pope will also need to review John Paul's ban on contraception. John Paul became pope before AIDS overtook Africa, but the emergence of the disease did little to dampen his fierce opposition to the use of condoms. He saw contraception as corrupting the ideal of monogamous marital sex. But as the infection rate in Africa has increased, unease has grown among Roman Catholics. Even some cardinals say using condoms is justified if it prevents infection. Some Catholics believe the Pope's hostility to contraception has damaged the Church's standing in the developed world too. John Paul felt that the growing tendency of Catholics to ignore the ban on contraception constituted direct disobedience to him as Pope. That made him determined to enforce the rules. His failure to do so further undermined the Church's authority. The Church faces a third crisis: dwindling numbers of priests and falling congregations. The developed world seems to be losing its faith. In countries such as France, pews are emptying as secular values take over from Christian ones. Few men are being ordained, and the average age of priests is growing. Half of French priests are expected to die in the next decade.
To change this downward trend is going to be an enormous challenge for anybody being elected to succeed John Paul II. I think, in fact, this will be one of the main considerations when the cardinals meet in conclave, how they're going to want to choose someone who might have the vision to change this downward trend in Western Europe.
An abiding memory of John Paul II will be his declining years. In Slovakia in 2003, he was occasionally lost for words. His fading health and reported lapses of memory led to doubts about his ability to manage the world's largest church. Questions were raised about who else might be running the Vatican. In recent months, with John Paul determined to stay in office, anxiety about his fitness increased. As medical science made it possible to extend life, what should be done about a mentally incapacitated pope? That spectre, apparently avoided this time, is an issue the Church can no longer ignore. John Paul inspired tens of millions with his humanity. Even his public death has been a witness to the Christian faith for which he stood. His conservatism came from a desire to create the conditions where life could flourish and death could not. This most remarkable of men left the post of Pope as the world's supreme moral voice. He's left his successor with an enormous weight of responsibility. Robert Piggott, BBC News.
The Pope has been a dominant figure on the world stage for the last quarter century. His death is being felt by people of all faiths and those of no faith. And the world's Catholic community is in deep mourning. There are nearly 1 billion baptised Catholics in the world. That's more than 17% of the global population. Nearly half of them live in the Americas, more than 500 million. About a quarter are in Europe, around 280 million. More than 13% live in Africa. That's around 140 million people. 10% of Catholics live in Asia, about 113 million. Less than 1% of Catholics live in Oceania. By the end of 2005, it's estimated there'll be more than 1.1 billion Catholics around the world. Growth is fastest in Africa and Asia. During his papacy, Pope John Paul travelled extensively throughout the developing world, often speaking out against poverty and injustice, but at the same time using his travels to help maintain his authority on the Church's teachings. Emily Buchanan reports.
With double the number of Catholics in the developing world as in Europe, John Paul II devoted enormous energy to his visits to the poorest countries, despite declining health. He returned again and again to Latin America. There, the Catholic Church faced the challenge of many highly popular priests whom it suspected of being Marxist. To Pope John Paul, the idea of a priest-politician was abhorrent. During a visit to Nicaragua, he condemned the so-called liberation theology created by left-wing priests as a deviation.
John Paul II was very radical in his social outlook, if you look at his teaching, but was very conservative in his understanding of church and of his basic theology. The end result was that those theologians that were judged to have overstepped the mark were often brought to order.
One of those brought to order was the revolutionary Brazilian theologian Leonardo Boff. He was summoned to Rome and was eventually barred from teaching and writing. The antipathy between the Pope and communism delayed his visit to Cuba until late in his papacy. Accepting an invitation from Fidel Castro, the Pope was even-handed in his criticism of atheist Marxist states and of the excesses of capitalism. Castro was particularly pleased to hear the Pope attack the American trade embargo. Pope John Paul always seemed more at ease on his visits to Africa. Africa is the only area of the world where the number of priests is increasing. John Paul II knew that in the future there could be an African pope. The Pope worked hard for dialogue between faiths, but even so, relations were sometimes strained. In Sri Lanka, Buddhist monks were angry about comments on their faith made in a book by the Pope himself.
The Roman Catholic Church in the last 2 decades has found it very difficult to know how to deal with the other major world religions. I think there's a sense in which the Pope and the Catholic Church wanted to say that through the person of Jesus of Nazareth, through the Christ, you have the way of salvation.
But other churches offered a quicker path to salvation. Across South America, hundreds of thousands were tempted away from Catholicism by the lure of a Protestant God who promised the poor instant prosperity, and papal visits attempted to reverse the trend. Of his many visits to Asia, the most remarkable was when he celebrated Mass in the Philippines' capital, Manila. 1 million had been expected, 4 million turned out, making it the biggest papal Mass in history. The Pope's message: since his followers couldn't come to Rome, Rome would come to them.
Over 13% of the world's Catholics live in Africa. Our World Affairs correspondent Mike Wooldridge asked Cardinal Wilfred Napier, Archbishop of Durban in South Africa, how much of an impact he believed Africa had on Pope John Paul II.
I think a great deal, because of the vibrancy of the faith. The celebrations are obviously celebrations. Wherever he went, it was always a great joyous occasion.
Would it be good for the Church if it had a Pope from Africa, possibly even now?
I suppose, wherever the Pope comes from, it'd be good for the Church. For Africa, I'm not so sure that we are there yet, but it would be certainly a breath of fresh air, I would imagine.
And would you expect to be among the contenders?
I don't think so. And you might ask me why. And I would say, knowing myself and knowing what I believe are the things that the qualities that the Pope would need at this time, we need somebody who's a bit of a visionary, who can dream up and see into the distance where the Church needs to go, how it needs to respond, not just react, but respond to some of the situations that have developed. And somebody who's going to continue where Pope John Paul II left off. Concern about the family, he's concerned about youth, which we're all seeing into the future, where the Church needs to make contact with the world. That's what I think the next Pope would need to do, to continue that.
There are those who say that John Paul II's opposition to the use of condoms in the face of the HIV/AIDS epidemic has been damaging, especially in Africa. Do you have some sympathy with his critics? Do you think the time has come to change the Church's position?
Yeah, I would argue that we actually need to address the seriousness of the AIDS pandemic by looking at the root causes. And the root causes are basically irresponsible behavior, whether it's sexual or drugs or whatever. And that's what we need to address, the change of behavior. I believe that's how Uganda succeeded to a large extent in turning around their situation, that message of change of behavior. And I would also say that the severity of the pandemic is such that we need something as radical as to say abstinence and fidelity are the answers to the AIDS problem.
How important is it to protect Catholic beliefs and worship when traditional cultural practices are strong, as they often are in Africa?
I don't know whether I would use the word protect. I would say, how do we guide the dialogue between the two? Because I think it has to be a dialogue. There are certainly things in African traditional practice and religious belief even, which are not out of touch with what the gospel has to say. But there would be elements that would be contrary, and I think it's how to keep that balance. That, I think, is where the challenge for the African Church lies at the moment. Many bishops I've actually heard saying, we can't be the ones that are going to bring about the enculturation. We're too brought up in the Western way of thinking. We need people who are coming from a more African base to be able to do that.
How far do you see the growth of Islam in Africa as a challenge to the Church?
Islam is becoming a very serious challenge. And I think where the challenge comes in even more importantly is that Islam has a very strict code of behavior, code of life. It's comprehensive. That's what the Catholic Church used to be, but probably too narrow. And that's why when the restraints were removed, the thing, as it were, exploded, and we're left with quite a good core, I would say, of people who really do believe, and what they practice is what they believe. And I think that's where we need to take up the challenge of Islam, is to make sure that our own understanding and practice of the faith is such that we don't need to fear Islam.
Are the forces of globalization in the world an opportunity for Africa, would you say, or a threat?
I think if you're looking at it from an economic, social, moral point of view, globalization really is a threat to Africa. There's no way that African cultures can stand up to the bombardment that's coming from the media in particular, that globalization has brought into their lounges. When you think that the standard bearers of African culture and society are generally less educated than the young people who are the leaders of tomorrow and who are being completely globalized, westernized. And I think that is a concern to me, that we're losing those basic values. And Africa has some very, very good basic values which globalization doesn't take into account.
The defining moment of his pontificate for many observers was the first visit to his native Poland as Pope. He addressed millions of people and drew the world's attention to the struggle between the state's communist ideology and the democratic aims of the Solidarity Union. As Angus Roxburgh reports, many people regard his stance against communism as his greatest achievement.
In 1979, a year after being elected, the Polish Pope returned home to start a revolution. Millions turned out to see him wherever he went. No communist country had ever seen anything like it.
Maluchy ze mną tak kiwały.
John Paul did nothing so crude as to criticise the authorities. He merely gave the people a sense of moral superiority and hope. Solidarity was the communist bloc's first free trade union, set up in the heat of strikes led by Lech Wałęsa at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk. Inspired by the Polish Pope, they humiliated the government.
The Holy Father brought back moral values, and they defeated the communist system. The communists were as frightened of those values as the devil is of holy water. So the Pope is the author of the victory over communism.
Wałęsa signed the document recognising solidarity with an outsized souvenir Pope pen. The truce with the communists was fragile and solidarity was soon banned. But even the man who imposed martial law to squash it understood that the Pope's influence had lit a flame that could not be doused again.
Of course, the social and economic conditions were ripe for a protest, but the Pope in his teachings served as a detonator who liberated the spirit of society and gave it strength.
In 1987, on his third visit to Poland, the Pope prayed at the Gdansk monument to workers killed by the communist regime. Now he seemed to take a conscious step from the pulpit into the political arena. Celebrating Mass before a crowd of 750,000, he told them there is no struggle more effective than solidarity. Now the scene was set for revolution, not just in Poland, but all over Eastern Europe. The sense of inner freedom inspired by the Pope here was spreading throughout the communist bloc, and with a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, simultaneously loosening the chains, it was only a matter of time before the people would break free. At the end of 1989, Gorbachev went to the Vatican for a historic meeting between the man who nudged Eastern Europe towards freedom and the man who let them go. It set the seal on a year, indeed a decade, of change in the communist bloc. Free elections in Poland, won overwhelmingly by solidarity, started a chain reaction which ended with the dismantling of the Berlin Wall. Doubtless it would all have happened eventually anyway, but without the Polish Pope, it might have taken much longer.
Well, tributes to the Pope have been flooding into the BBC website. Our correspondent Matthew Charles has been reading through them. Matthew.
Yeah, that's right. We've had hundreds of emails into the BBC since the death of the Pope was announced. All of them, of course, paying tribute, and they're coming from all over the world. Nicola in Scotland says, "You have been an inspiration to a world. We are better people because of your leadership. You will be sorely missed, but we will carry you in our hearts always." Victoria from Cardiff says, "I am not Catholic, but I feel truly saddened by the death of John Paul II. I visited the Vatican last year and felt honoured to attend a church service led by the Pope. His spiritual presence there was overwhelming." And Peggy in Texas says, "He was a wonderful man. May we all strive to live our lives in the manner of his." But these emails are coming not just from Catholics, but from all religions. David in New York says, "I'm a Protestant, but Pope John Paul II stood for all people and was a true representative of God. He stood for freedom when others would not." Nazanin, who's also from New York, says, "While I'm Muslim, I am deeply saddened by the passing of Pope John Paul II. He was a great man who respected human life and dignity and strove to bring the people of the world together regardless of their religious differences." And of course, we've had tributes from the Pope's native Poland. Agnieszka there says, "I'm so proud to be one of the Pope's countrymen, and I'll always try to keep him alive in my words, deeds, and in my heart." But perhaps the most fitting tribute, which describes how all of the Catholic community will be feeling tonight, is from Michael. "We have lost our father," he says.
Matthew, many thanks. To recap, at least 100,000 people have gathered in St. Peter's Square in Rome as Catholics around the world mourn the death of the Pope. This is the scene there live from the Vatican. St. Peter's Basilica illuminated as it has been over these past couple of nights as tens of thousands of people have waited down there in the square anxiously for any news emanating from the Vatican. We've had very detailed medical bulletins over the past few days since the Pope's health deteriorated so dramatically, and As hopes faded, more and more people began to gather. That culminated this evening when, at just after 9 o'clock local time in the Vatican, they announced the death of Pope John Paul II, dying peacefully in his apartment, his final hours marked by uninterrupted prayer. He was 84 and had led the church for 26 years. President Bush said Roman Catholics had lost their shepherd and the world, a champion of human freedom. Queen Elizabeth said she received the news of the Pope's death with deep sorrow.
Hello there, we had some mild weather on Saturday. Quick look back at the temperatures, quite nice, 17s, 18s. Won't do as well for the day today, but could even be on the wet side as well for many. Band of rain coming into parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, spreading in the wet weather here. Elsewhere, it is just some patchy cloud, fairly bright to start with, over eastern parts of England, down towards the southeast. The odd bit of mist, but our band of rain coming into western Scotland, Northern Ireland, slowly working south and east through the day, so by the afternoon, we'll probably see it over a fair part of Scotland, just fringing into the northwest parts of Wales, and there could even be the odd shower just sneaking up ahead of our weather front, maybe into northern parts of England, but still fairly bright and dry over much of East Anglia, the southeast, and also brighter skies behind our weather front into western Scotland, Northern Ireland, and it will feel cooler and fresher here, maybe only 10s to 12s behind our weather front, but we still could perhaps see a 15 to 17 across the south and the east. But Monday is a wet day as well over a fair part of England, even Wales with our weather front sitting down about here, so grab the umbrella with that. Brighter skies behind it, and then seeing quite a few showers work into parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, with enough cold air coming in. Some of these could even be wintry over the higher ground of Scotland. A bit of thunder as well, and the temperatures maybe 9s, 10s, 11s. Still perhaps getting to about a 12 to 14 across the south and the east. Then to Tuesday, it's a bit of a resting day in between the weather systems. The first one moves away, high pressure builds in. This one, another band of rain spreading into Scotland and Northern Ireland with some heavier downpours even as it comes across Scotland and Northern Ireland through the day. Not bad down towards the southeast, just maybe the odd shower here and there, and temperatures 9s to still maybe 13, 14 further south and east. For Wednesday, quite an unsettled day with quite a massive weather system moving across. Good bit of rain with it as well. Some heavy downpours, even from, say, southern parts of Wales right up into northern England. As this whole mass of rain works through, still maybe some winteriness over the higher ground of Scotland, and the whole mass of rain spreading its way through as we go through Wednesday. Even a bit of wind as well, windy sort of day with temperatures cool, perhaps 9s, 10s for Scotland, same sort of thing Northern Ireland. Maybe further south, 12 to 13, so definitely getting cooler as we go in towards the middle of the week, and staying unsettled as well, probably into the later parts of the week. Quick peek at things across to the continent, maybe heading there for the day. It looks not too bad for the most part. There is a big ridge of high pressure over most of the central and eastern parts of the continent. Obviously, fairly sunny to say the least here for the next day or so. 18 for Paris, fine here. Not bad, and even further south, Rome, looking at fine weather. Notice just further south, seeing a few showers, but generally most of the central, eastern parts of the continent in pretty good shape. That's the weather for now.
Pope John Paul II has died at the age of 84 after a long struggle with illness. Tens of thousands of mourners have gathered in St. Peter's Square in Rome. Pope John Paul has been leader of the Catholic Church since 1978. Among tributes from around the world, President Bush says the world has lost a champion of human freedom. Hello and welcome to BBC News. I'm Karen Giannoni. The spiritual leader of the world's Roman Catholics, Pope John Paul II, has died. He had been gravely ill since Thursday. He died in bed at his apartment in the Vatican. His condition had worsened considerably in the past 24 hours, with severe heart and kidney problems allied to the effects of Parkinson's disease. This is the scene live in Rome. People remain there in the square, where tens of thousands of people were there earlier to hear the news of the pontiff's death. The church bells began tolling throughout the city. The news of his death, as the announcement was made at 9:37 local time in the Vatican, following a series of worsening health problems, including heart failure. The Pope had been in a very serious condition for over a day before the news finally came. Gavin Hewitt has this report on the day's events.
It had been the announcement that Rome had long expected.
Carissimi fratelli e sorelle, alle 21:37 il nostro amatissimo.
Dearest brothers and sisters, at 9:27, our beloved Holy Father, John Paul II, returned to the house of our Father. At first, the crowd in St. Peter's Square was silent as it took in Archbishop Sandri's words. Then, many broke down in tears as the Vatican's funeral bell was rung. During the day, they had been chanting the Pope's name, willing him to defy his failing health. Now, some stood with heads bowed, while others sang hymns. One man kissed a picture of the Pope he was holding. There was real affection here for a leader who had travelled more than any other pope and had fought illness for so long. Many said that this man of strong, unbending faith had been an inspiration.
He was instrumental in my deciding to become a priest and has been an inspiration for me throughout my priesthood. His courage, his tenacity, his evangelical nature that continued to inspire me and continues to inspire the world.
So many mixed emotions, so sad, so somber, but so happy he's called home. It sounds like he was ready.
Sure, I know. A couple weeks ago he said he had abandoned himself to God's will, and for someone to have that strength and that courage, and that he was at peace with his situation right now. So I think that's how we all can feel.
Exactly, and it sounds like he was still coherent and lucid, up to the final moments of his life, and that's to be able to, pass on with such dignity. That's how he lived his whole life.
In the square, there were people from the Pope's native Poland who remembered his part in ending communism in Eastern Europe.
But I think that we are proud that a Pope was Polish and that it was a huge man for all church, really.
An archbishop told the crowd, "We all feel like orphans this evening." And it was immediately apparent that there'll be a huge outpouring of grief for the man who led the Catholic Church for 26 years. As soon as the Pope's death was announced, people began streaming here to St. Peter's Square, and they're still arriving now. Many of them were in tears, but many of them also spoke warmly about the Pope's struggle over the last few days, saying they were among the most impressive days of his papacy, living out his message that there can be serenity even in the heart of suffering. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, at the Vatican.
Around the world, over 1 billion Catholics are now in mourning. Tributes to the Pope have stressed his work for peace and the distances he travelled to bind his church together, especially in Latin America. The Brazilian President Lula da Silva said Pope John Paul had influenced the course of modern history. President Alvaro Uribe of Colombia described the Pope as a spiritual power. The Cuban Foreign Minister Felipe Pérez Roque characterized the Pope as a friend of the poor. And President Bush described him as a champion of human freedom. Adam Brooks is in Washington.
St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Just a few hours after the Pope's passing, President Bush and his wife Laura made their way here to join Roman Catholics in prayer. The President is leading America in mourning the Pope. He's ordered flags on federal buildings to be flown at half-mast, and it's expected, though not yet confirmed, that he'll travel to Rome for the funeral. Earlier, President Bush had addressed the nation, And he stressed the theme of liberty, uniting America and John Paul II's Vatican.
All popes belong to the world. But Americans had special reason to love the man from Krakow. In his visits to our country, the Pope spoke of our providential Constitution, the self-evident truths about human dignity in our Declaration, and the blessings of liberty that follow from them.
The man from Krakow is celebrated here as a great leader against communism, and also as a great leader for religious conservatism, whether Catholic or Protestant. Here he is in Missouri in 1999, still robust, still a strong communicator, mixing with activists who are opposed to abortion. It was in America as much as anywhere that his powerful public profile was forged.
Anyone who gave his life so totally, so completely, so beautifully to other people, has to have a great place in heaven.
He's been a father to the entire world, so I think that, to me, that is his legacy.
He took the church to the people, took the church to the young people, and that's why there's a sadness. There's a sadness for us, but there's a great joy for him as he goes on.
Pope John Paul leaves behind a troubled Catholic Church in America, reeling from sexual abuse scandals and short of priests. But just now, it's the power of his time in office that's being remembered. Today, the President referred to Pope John Paul as a hero for the ages. And here at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, as across America, the papacy of John Paul II is being remembered as one of historic significance. Adam Brooks, BBC News, Washington.
Well, live now to the BBC's Katya Adler from St. Peter's Square in Rome. Katya.
Well, yes, here at St. Peter's Square, it's actually 3 o'clock in the morning local time, but people are still making their way to St. Peter's Square, and there's several thousand people still there, most settling down now for the night, nestling in sleeping bags or with blankets wrapped around them as they're lying on the very cold cobblestones. But they say they don't want to go away. They want to stay near the Pope, even though he's